I still remember the way the light fell through the trees that morning, thin gold and silent. We stood at the mouth of an old concrete shelter half buried in the hillside, the air inside colder than it should have been for July. On the floor lay 3 sleeping bags neatly rolled. Beside them sat a spiral notebook, pages curling with age. The first line was written in a young hand that trembled just enough to make the words uneven. "We can't go back now. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice." Back in 2014, my world revolved around the park. Long drives along Skyline Drive Trail, reports the smell of wet pine after a summer storm. I'd spent 25 years with the National Park Service by then, and I thought I'd seen every kind of trouble the mountains could hide. But that June was different. Quiet, steady, almost too peaceful. Most mornings I'd leave my house before sunrise coffee in a metal thermos and roll through the gate at Thornton Gap while mist still hung low over the Shenandoah Valley. Deer would freeze in the grass when they heard the engine, and the ranger station windows glowed with that familiar orange light from the fluorescents inside. Life then was predictable forms, maps and conversations about bear sightings and trail conditions. Tyler used to stop by those mornings. He was fresh out of college tan from a summer job at an outfitter in Charlottesville full of plans and caffeine. Uncle Dan, he'd call me, even though we weren't blood. One last adventure before real life starts. He had that energy you only get at 22. Restless, fearless, convinced the world will wait for you to catch up. Amber was the heart of their little group. I'd met her a few times when they came through town for supplies. She had a calmness about her, always the one folding maps, checking gear twice. When she smiled, it wasn't loud like Tyler's. It was quiet, steady. The kind of smile that made you believe things would be fine. Chris Park was newer to me. I knew his type, though, organized, maybe a little controlling the planner every hiking group needs. He had lists printed on waterproof paper and kept his compass on a lanyard like a badge. Tyler joked that Chris could get lost in a grocery store, but never on a mountain. They balanced each other that way, Tyler's wildness, Amber's kindness, Chris's precision. They came by the ranger station the morning of June 5th. Linda Harper handled their permit. She always remembered faces, and later she told me they were among the most prepared hikers she'd seen that summer. 7 days, planned 60 miles of trail, all the right equipment. They even left a written itinerary with Tyler's folks. I saw them briefly in the parking lot afterward, tightening the straps on their packs. It was a clear day, maybe 75 degrees, the kind of weather that makes the leaves shimmer like glass. Tyler waved at me with that grin of his and said, "See you in a week, Dan. Maybe I'll finally out-hike you." I laughed and told him I'd hold him to it. It was just banter, nothing serious. I watched the 3 of them walk down the trailhead, sunlight bouncing off their gear, the forest swallowing their laughter. That image stayed with me longer than I'd ever admit. Back in town, life moved at its usual small-town pace. Evenings were for porch lights and the hum of cicadas. My wife Karen worked at the library then. She'd close up around 6, and we'd sit out front with iced tea listening to the highway far off like a steady breath. News traveled slow here, birth announcements on the bulletin board, weather forecasts on AM radio. When Patricia called that first week, it wasn't panic in her voice, just a touch of concern. "They should be out by tomorrow," she said, half laughing. You know, Tyler probably added another detour. I told her not to worry. Hikers run late all the time. Maybe they decided to stretch the trip. But even then, something in her tone lingered after the call ended. The weekend came and went. We had a cookout that Saturday. The neighborhood kids played tag in the yard, and someone brought a peach cobbler that collapsed in the middle. The air was thick with the smell of charcoal and honeysuckle. At one point, I caught myself glancing east toward the mountains, thinking about how many miles those 3 had covered by now. I told myself they were fine, probably at High Top Hut watching the same sunset we were. Sunday morning, I stopped by the ranger station again. Linda mentioned she hadn't seen their names in any shelter logs past Pass Mountain, Maybe they just forgot to sign, she said, but her brow furrowed when she said it. I nodded, pretending not to notice that worry creeping into her voice. On Monday, clouds rolled in from the west, heavy with rain. The smell of ozone filled the air. I remember watching a thunderhead crawl over the ridge and wondering if the kids had found shelter in time. A call came through around noon. Patricia again, this time her voice tight. They were supposed to check out yesterday, she said. Nobody's heard from them. Their phones go straight to voicemail. I told her I'd look into it, that it was probably just bad signal. I believed that too, or maybe I just needed to. Out here you learn that silence doesn't always mean danger. Sometimes the forest swallows sound, sometimes it hides it. That evening I drove home along Skyline Drive. The rain had cooled everything to a sharp 58 degrees and fog curled through the trees in long, thin ribbons. I stopped at an overlook to stretch my legs. Below me, the valley lights blinked like scattered embers. I thought of Tyler, of how many times I'd warned him to respect this mountain, how fast weather could turn, how easy it was to misjudge a ridge. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the fog had thickened so much I could barely see my own headlights. Karen had left the porch light on. It cut a small, warm circle in the mist. Inside the house smelled like wet wood and lemon cleaner. I hung up my jacket, set the radio low, and told myself everything was fine. But around midnight, I found myself standing by the window, staring toward the mountains again. The rain had stopped, yet the silence outside felt wrong, too complete, too still. I picked up the phone twice, ready to call Linda, then set it down. It was late. I'd talk to her in the morning. Somewhere out there, 3 young hikers were settling into their sleeping bags, laughing, maybe planning breakfast, unaware that the line between adventure and disaster was already gone. The next morning, the sun rose into a pale, washed-out sky. I poured my coffee, stepped onto the porch, and waited for the phone to ring, waited for someone to tell me they'd checked out, that they were safe. But the call never came. The light on the porch stayed burning long after daylight filled the valley, and the mountains looked the same as they always had, quiet, patient, and indifferent. By the next morning, the porch light had burned itself out, but the uneasy feeling in my gut hadn't gone anywhere. I stopped by the ranger station before dawn, the sky still bruised purple over the ridgeline. Linda Harper was already there, pouring her second cup of coffee, her radio hissing low on the counter. When she saw me, she didn't even need to ask why I'd come early. Still nothing she said. The kids hadn't checked out, hadn't been seen by any hikers heading north or south, and their last known log was still the one at Pass Mountain Hut 8 days earlier. By park standards, that's the sort of gap that tightens your chest. By noon, their families were calling Patricia first, then a relative of Amber's who sounded brittle, almost mechanical from worry. I filed the report myself, filled out the incident log, called in the superintendent, and within an hour, we were in search and rescue mode. I'd coordinated dozens of missing hiker searches before, and at first, this one followed the same rhythm optimism logistics-controlled urgency. But I'll tell you something about this one never felt routine. Maybe it was the age of the 3 smart kids, not thrill-seekers. Maybe it was the way the weather turned so quickly that week. The air had that early summer thickness that makes a man sweat even standing still then. By afternoon, the wind would drop and a storm would roll across the Blue Ridge like a moving wall. By sunset, the first helicopter was in the air, sweeping the ridges with thermal imaging. On the ground, we split teams along the route between Pass Mountain and Swift Run Gap. I led a small crew along a tributary trail, one that ran parallel to the Appalachian but veered west through denser cover. Every few minutes, we'd stop and call their names. The sound of it, those young names echoing through the hollow, still sticks with me. The forest has a way of throwing sound back at you like it's mocking your hope. That first night, we found nothing. No prints, no campsite, not a single scrap of gear. The next morning, we regrouped, rechecked their intended route, and extended the search perimeter. The crews were tired but focused. Volunteers poured in from nearby towns, even students from the university. Everyone wanted to help, but by the end of the second day, it was clear the usual patterns didn't apply. Most lost hikers leave signs, broken branches, scraps of food wrappers, footprints in soft soil. It's rare for 3 people to vanish clean. By the third day, we brought in dogs. I watched the handlers work them from the trailhead, their noses to the ground, tails flicking. They picked up the group's scent briefly around Pass Mountain Hut, but less than a mile south it dissipated. One of the handlers muttered, "Like they just flew away." It wasn't the first time I'd heard that line in this job, but it rarely sat well. At night, the command post filled with maps pinned to corkboard red lines tracing search grids. Radios buzzed, voices crackled, batteries died and were replaced. Around midnight, we got a faint hit on a thermal sweep, 3 warm spots near a drainage basin west of the ridge. We sent a team in, hearts pounding, but when they got there, it was just deer bedded down in leaves. That kind of false alarm cuts deep. On the 5th day, the helicopters switched to daylight searches. The families arrived that morning, Patricia with her husband Amber's parents, and Chris's father, a quiet man who carried a small notebook and wrote down everything anyone said. I met them at the ranger station. Patricia looked smaller somehow, her eyes wide but unfocused, like she was listening to a sound no one else could hear. She grabbed my arm and said, "You'll find them, right? You'll bring him back." I told her yes. Of course we would. I've said that line more times than I can count, and every time it feels like a promise you shouldn't make but do anyway. Over the next week, the search grew into something massive. 200 volunteers, specialized trackers, drones, even teams from neighboring parks. Every day started with new hope and ended with quiet disappointment. We checked ridges, caves, stream crossings, and old fire roads. We combed the same stretches twice, 3 times, certain we must have missed something. But the forest stayed silent. On the 10th day, the air started to change. People stopped talking about rescue and started using words like recovery. You could feel morale breaking down, not through arguments, but through silence, those long, wordless breaks between radio calls, the exhausted looks exchanged over coffee cups. I remember standing at an overlook late one afternoon, staring into the green haze of the valley, when one of the newer rangers asked me quietly, "Dan, what do you think happened?" I said the only honest thing I could, "I don't know. But I don't think they're far." A week later, the official search was suspended. The weather had turned against us, heavy rain that turned the trails into rivers, visibility dropping to nothing. The families stayed a few more days, each walking parts of the trail with local guides leaving notes and ribbons on trees. Patricia left a photo of Tyler at Pass Mountain Hut tucked under a rock, like a prayer folded into the earth. After they left the park, settled back into its usual rhythm. Tourists taking photos, deer grazing near the pull-offs, but for those of us who'd been there, it wasn't the same. Every creek in the woods felt loaded, every shadow a question mark. I stayed on through the fall hiking sections of the trail in my off hours, half hoping I'd find something, one of their camp tools, maybe a torn pack strap, but I never did. The official conclusion was that they'd likely been lost off trail and succumbed to exposure or fallen somewhere unreachable. We held a memorial service that August. I watched Patricia place wildflowers beside an empty frame that bore her son's name, and I felt something twist in me that still hasn't untangled. Years passed and the world moved on. I retired from the park in 2019, sold my truck, started volunteering at the visitor center. By then, the case had faded into one of those half-remembered local mysteries, the kind people mentioned around campfires when the night stretched too long. But I could never fully let it go. Every June, I'd take a quiet hike up Pass Mountain Stand near the shelter and just listen. I don't know what I was waiting to hear. Maybe wind through the trees, maybe their laughter again, but I always came back with the same silence. Then, 9 years later, in the summer of 2023, that silence broke. It was a Sunday when I got the call. The park dispatch officer said a couple of day hikers had found something unusual near Big Meadows, an old structure, maybe a forgotten maintenance shed hidden deep off trail. What caught their attention wasn't the building itself, but what was inside. "It looks lived in," she said. "Recently." I felt a chill run down my arms. By the time I reached headquarters, the details were still forming. The hikers, a husband and wife, had reported finding 3 sleeping bags, camping gear, and a notebook with names. The dispatcher didn't want to say them aloud over the line, but I already knew before she did. When I heard the words, "Tyler Morrison," through the radio static, it was like the air left the room. I joined the response team heading out. The couple had marked their route with orange flagging tape so we could find the site faster. It took us 3 hours of pushing through thick undergrowth to reach it. When the trees opened there, it was barely visible even from a few feet away, a small concrete bunker set into a slope, its entrance covered in vines and moss. You'd never see it unless you were right on top of it. Inside it smelled of earth and cold iron. A camp stove sat against one wall, a few wrappers on the ground dated just months earlier. 3 sleeping bags were arranged neatly on the floor. In the middle, on a flat stone, lay that notebook. The cover was worn, soft edges curling. I opened it carefully. The handwriting hit me like a punch. Familiar loops, the same block letters I'd seen on the trail logs back in 2014. The first entry dated June 6, 2014. The next ran through years, 2015, 2016, all the way to 2023. The last line, written just days before, was in a shakier hand. "Hikers getting closer. Need to move soon. I want to go home." The words made the air feel thinner, like the whole hillside had started holding its breath. We stepped back outside, radios buzzing as more officers arrived. The shelter sat less than 3 miles from where our search had passed again and again 9 years earlier. We'd been right over them, probably more than once. That night, as evidence teams documented everything, I stood near the tree line and watched the sky fade into evening. The mountains that had once felt like home now felt like a riddle I'd never solved. Somewhere out there, maybe even within sight, 3 people who should have grown older, married, started families, had been living in the shadows all this time. As the lights from the rangers' trucks flickered through the trees, I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. We'd found the place where they'd been, but not them. The woods had closed around another secret, and for the first time in years, I felt that same uneasy stillness return like a heartbeat gone quiet just before the storm hits again. We stayed out at that site until the light faded and the crickets started their evening chorus. The evidence crew had finished their photographs, packed up the notebook in a sterile bag, and started the long trek back down the ridge. I waited until the last truck pulled away before locking up the perimeter tape. The trees stood silent again, as if the forest had taken a breath and was waiting to exhale. I drove home in near-darkness headlights, tracing the narrow road, and I remember catching my reflection in the rearview mirror, older, tired eyes, still trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. After 9 years, we hadn't stumbled on a crime scene. We'd stumbled on proof of life. The next few days passed in a blur of questions. The FBI came in along with a handwriting specialist from Richmond. I sat in on the briefings, half as consultant, half as a man who just couldn't walk away. The notebook, the one they found on that stone floor, wasn't fiction or a prank. 3 distinct handwriting samples, all matched with university papers, birthday cards, and application forms the families provided. The lab confirmed what our hearts already knew: it was real. I was allowed to read the transcribed pages in a quiet office at headquarters, each line under a protective sleeve. At first, the words were casual notes about weather, food, and small jokes that sounded exactly like kids on an adventure. But as I read further, something shifted. The tone tightened, then wavered, then hardened into a strange kind of logic. They'd left the main trail to explore an old path, stumbled upon the concrete shelter, and thought it'd be a good place to stay the night. That was the start. By the second day, they'd tried to head back, but lost the main trail under heavy canopy. The GPS wouldn't lock signal, and their phones barely worked in that terrain. They'd wandered in circles, confused but not desperate yet. The turning point came 4 days later. One of them Chris had written about hearing helicopters. They'd gotten close enough to see a road and cars passing, but decided not to approach, worried about how it might look, how people might judge them for going off route. "We'll just wait until the search dies down," he'd written. "Then we can slip out quietly." The next pages were full of hesitation rationalizations, stacked like stones to hold up an illusion. They thought it'd be easier to come out after a few days, then after a few weeks, then months. But shame, I've learned, is a strange kind of wilderness. Once you're inside it, every path out looks like danger. As the months in the notebook passed, their language changed. The handwriting grew cramped sentences, shorter, more defensive. Chris took over most of the writing, the planner even in isolation. Amber's entries faded to fragments, small thoughts about her parents. A dream about running water, a line that said simply, "I miss being known." That one stayed with me. They'd built routines, rationing, collecting water, even stealing supplies from campsites when hunger grew too heavy to ignore. The entries from the winters described how they insulated the shelter with moss and leaves, how they learned which mushrooms were safe, how they started to believe this was their only option. By 2016, they weren't surviving an accident anymore. They were living a secret. I remember sitting there with those pages spread in front of me, the office silent except for the hum of the air vent. After so many years of assuming the worst, I found myself struggling with the truth they hadn't died out there. They'd stayed. Voluntarily, at least in the beginning. I think that's what hit the families hardest. Death, you can grieve. But choosing to vanish, that's a wound that keeps bleeding. The park turned into a maze of investigators that summer. Old reports were reopened, theft complaints, rechecked maps, cross-referenced with the shelter's coordinates. It turned out that over the years, rangers had logged dozens of small, unexplained campsite thefts, packets of food batteries, medical kits. At the time, everyone blamed wildlife or careless hikers. Now each of those old reports felt like a missed heartbeat. They'd been right under our noses the whole time, moving just far enough to stay unseen. The families came down again to meet with the FBI. I was there when they were shown the first photos from the shelter. Patricia couldn't speak for a full minute. She just touched the image of her son's sleeping bag, traced the stitching like she could reach through the photograph. Amber's sister Ashley stared at the notebook cover and whispered, "She wrote that with the same pen she used to write to me." Chris's father asked the question none of us wanted to answer. If they've been alive this long, why haven't they come home? No one spoke after that. Outside, summer thunder rolled over the valley. I stood with Patricia in the parking lot afterward. She looked at me and said, "You think shame can kill a person?" "Dan," I said, "I didn't know, but maybe it can keep them half alive." In the weeks that followed, the park set up surveillance near the shelter. Motion sensors, trail cameras, even small drones that flew grids at night. I helped coordinate placement hiking out with the younger rangers who moved quieter than I ever could. The woods were thick, that seasoned vines, heavy ground soft from rain. Every rustle felt like a presence just out of reach. Some nights I'd swear I saw movement between the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. Psychologists were brought in to consult. They talked about something called escalating commitment, how small mistakes pile up until the weight of fixing them feels impossible. Add in isolation and a dominant personality, and you get what they called shared delusion. It's not madness exactly. It's belief gone feral. Listening to them talk about it was like hearing someone describe fog as if it were a living thing. About a week after the story broke publicly, tips poured in. A trail worker remembered seeing 3 ragged figures a few years earlier moving fast when he called out. A camper in 2021 reported missing food footprints that didn't match her own. A ranger, Marcus Webb, told me quietly he'd once spotted shapes watching him from the tree line while clearing a washout in 2022. They knew the park better than we did, he said. They picked their moments. Each lead sparked hope, but hope can turn cruel when it keeps failing. We'd hike out, check campsites, follow faint tracks, and come back empty. Still, the signs kept coming: fresh fire rings in places no one should have camped, scavenged wrappers, and once a half-buried tin can stamped with a 2022 date. It was like chasing ghosts that refused to die. By late July, one of the trail cameras caught movement. Just before 4 in the morning, a single figure stepped into frame, thin-layered clothing face hidden by the angle. They stood at the shelter's entrance for several minutes, barely moving. Then they turned and slipped back into the dark. The footage wasn't clear enough for a positive ID, but based on the height and posture, analysts believed it might have been Amber. Watching that clip later in the operations room, I felt a hollow ache in my chest. She was right there, alive, maybe within shouting distance, and still we couldn't reach her. Afterward, Ashley Hayes wrote a letter, one she insisted be left inside the shelter. I carried it out myself with a ranger escort. We laid it on the stone floor where the notebook had been found. The paper trembled in the breeze from the doorway. She'd written about her parents, about the niece Amber never met, about forgiveness. "Nobody's angry," she wrote. "Nobody's waiting with judgment. Just come home." We sealed the letter in plastic, weighed it down with a small rock, and left. I stood there for a long time, staring into the dimness, wondering if somewhere nearby someone was watching us. Weeks passed with no response. The cameras caught nothing else, the motion sensors stayed quiet. But we knew better than to think that meant they were gone. These mountains have ways of keeping secrets longer than people can stand to look for them. The investigation stayed open technically. The FBI reclassified the 3 as endangered adults voluntarily avoiding contact, which sounds bureaucratic but really means there's nothing more the law can do. No crime to prosecute, no warrant to issue. Just the question that still hangs in the air: how do 3 people live that long in hiding a few miles from civilization and not step forward when given the chance? Sometimes, late at night, I replay that infrared clip in my mind, the figure standing at the door, one hand hovering like they almost reached out. I imagine what must have been going through her head, the fear, the guilt, the exhaustion. And I think about how close we came to ending it, to pulling them back into the world. But the truth is, some doors can't be forced open from the outside. By early August, the Rangers began rotating off surveillance duty. The equipment scaled back, the public attention fading again. I hiked up there one last time before the season changed. The air thick with the smell of wet pine and the steady drone of cicadas. The shelter looked the same, quiet, empty vines creeping back over the concrete. Inside, Ashley's letter was still there, untouched. I picked it up, read the first line again, then set it back down exactly where it had been. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees, and for a second, I thought I heard footsteps in the brush, soft, deliberate, gone, before I could turn. I didn't call out. After all these years, I've learned that in these woods, silence sometimes says more than any words could. When I finally made it back to my truck, the sky had started to dim, and the first whip-poor wills were calling. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, listening. Somewhere out there, maybe within miles, 3 people were still alive, still hiding from a world that would welcome them back without question. And as much as I wanted to believe they'd come out one day, part of me feared they never would. That night, as I locked up the ranger gate for the last time, I looked back toward the ridge. The mountains were just dark shapes against the fading sky, quiet, watchful waiting. And I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they'd ever let us find. That August, the forest changed in a way I can't quite describe. The leaves still moved in the wind, the creeks still ran cold, but the place felt aware, like it knew we were watching it again. I was out nearly every day with the younger rangers, checking cameras and old fire roads, hoping for another sign. We didn't say it out loud, but everyone knew the truth. The odds of finding those 3 alive and willing to come in were shrinking by the hour. The human body can survive on less than you think, but the mind, it wears down differently. By mid-month, a medical forensics team from Quantico had gone through everything we'd pulled from that shelter. The stove, the wrappers, the makeshift tools, the medical supplies, all logged and bagged. I stood beside the table when they laid it out. The sleeping bags were worn nearly through the fabric, thin as paper in spots. One of them had a tear near the zipper patched with duct tape. There was also a plastic jar filled with antibiotic pills, the kind you'd only get from raiding a hiker's first aid kit. They'd survived by scavenging, not luck. One of the examiners, a calm woman with tired eyes, flipped through the last pages of the notebook. "Look at this," she said. "See how the writing shakes here. Neurological instability, dehydration, maybe starvation." She pointed at the smudges along the lines, tiny crescent stains that under the light looked too dark to be dirt. "This is what happens when the body starts breaking down." She didn't need to say what we were all thinking. The more I read, the more that notebook felt less like a record and more like a slow-motion collapse. Tyler's entries became fewer. His words simple and sad short notes about pain, cold, and exhaustion. Chris's handwriting grew uneven, his sentences looping into each other like his thoughts were circling a drain. Amber was the last steady voice in those pages. Her words were clearer, almost pleading. "I read one entry twice. I can't keep doing this. I want to go home. He says we'll be punished. I don't care anymore." That line was dated just a few weeks before the hikers stumbled across the shelter. The FBI agents assigned to the case began piecing together a rough timeline, matching each entry to known thefts, nearby campsite reports, and sightings from other hikers. The picture that emerged wasn't easy to look at. They hadn't just hidden, they'd adapted almost professionally. They'd moved supplies across miles of terrain, created caches that blended into the landscape, even figured out how to avoid thermal detection. When one of the rangers tested the old shelter's structure with a heat scanner, it made perfect sense why we'd missed them all those years ago. The concrete walls buried under soil and moss bled no heat. It was like a bunker built by time itself. As word spread, the public's reaction shifted from sympathy to disbelief. Some people online called them cowards, said they'd wasted taxpayer money. Others romanticized them, called it the Great Escape. But those of us who'd read every word of that notebook knew the truth wasn't heroic or foolish. It was human. 3 kids made one bad decision, then convinced themselves they couldn't undo it. That's all it took. I met with Patricia again that month. She was renting a small cabin near the park by then, spending her days hiking trails she could manage alone. When I arrived, she had the notebook open on her kitchen table, a cup of tea going cold beside it. He wasn't a coward, she said more to herself than to me. He just got lost in his own fear. I didn't argue. There was nothing to gain from defining what had already broken her heart. The Rangers began broadcasting recorded messages across the park helicopters circling the valleys, speakers echoing through the ridges. Tyler, Amber, Chris. "You're not in trouble. Your families want you home. I helped record one of them." It felt strange speaking their names into a microphone, trying to sound steady. The sound carried far, bouncing off rock faces and dying into the wind. I remember thinking how haunting it must have been to hear that from the shadows if they were still out there. For weeks, nothing happened. Cameras caught no movement, no fresh tracks. Then near the end of August, a group of trail runners reported something odd. A small bundle of food left at a clearing, neatly wrapped, nothing missing. It wasn't typical animal behavior and no one else claimed it. We checked it the next day. Inside were protein bars, jerky, and a water filter. Clean, organized, and untouched. It looked like an offering or maybe a test to see if we'd take it. Around that same time, a private investigator hired by Chris's parents shared a report claiming a motion sensor near Skyline Drive had picked up faint movement late one night. Too blurred for ID, but the height matched a man's. It could have been anyone, a poacher, a drifter, But deep down, none of us believed that. The timing, the place, it fit too neatly. They were still nearby. The psychologists brought in for consultation said this kind of behavior wasn't uncommon in long-term isolation cases. Once the mind sets its own logic, it doesn't just snap back because someone offers help. They said returning might actually feel more dangerous to them than staying hidden. I thought about that for a long time. I'd spent most of my life out here, and I'd seen what solitude could do. Still 9 years of it. That's something else entirely. The last confirmed sign came at the end of July security footage from one of our infrared cameras. A single person stepping up to the shelter in the middle of the night, standing just outside the doorway. You could see their breath cloud in the cool air. They lingered looking down at something on the ground, probably Ashley's letter, and then turned back into the dark. That motion, that small turn of the shoulders, it wasn't panic or fear. It was hesitation. Whoever it was, they were torn between two worlds and couldn't cross the line between them. I watched that clip more times than I care to admit. There was something about the stillness of it, the way the figure almost seemed to sway, like they were fighting a decision. Every time I think of it, I wonder if Amber was standing there that night reading her sister's words, trying to find a way to believe them. The investigation began to wind down after that. There was nothing new to chase, no more evidence to collect. The shelter remained sealed off, but monitored. The families visited when they could, leaving small items, flowers, photos, sometimes just handwritten notes sealed in plastic. I'd walk by them on my patrols, each one a small act of hope pressed against concrete. By the start of fall, the official stance was that the three weren't missing anymore, not legally. Endangered adults voluntarily evading contact. That's the phrase the FBI used. It sounded clinical, but I suppose it was kinder than the alternative. We couldn't force them to come back, not without proof of a crime. All we could do was wait, knowing that the waiting itself was its own kind of punishment. The park quieted again when the leaves began to turn. The air thinned out, the crowds went home, and only the sound of wind moving through the hollows remained. I kept hiking near big meadows every weekend, telling myself it was routine, but I think part of me just needed to be close to the story that never ended. One afternoon in late September, I hiked up alone, no radio, no camera, just me and the sound of my boots in the dirt. I reached the shelter and stood there a while. The letter was gone. Maybe taken by weather, maybe by a hand that decided not to leave it behind. I sat down on a fallen log and waited, just listening to the forest breathe. For a long moment, I thought I heard movement behind me, soft, deliberate. A crunch of leaves, then nothing. I didn't turn around. By dusk, I started the walk back down. The woods were full of gold light, then shafts cutting through the branches, and I remember thinking how easily beauty and loss coexist here. You can't tell where one ends and the other begins. That night, as I drove home, I passed the ridge where the helicopters used to fly. The sky above it looked like it did 9 years ago, same color, same clouds rolling east. I pulled over and shut off the engine just to hear the quiet. Somewhere out there, maybe only miles away, 3 people were still living by firelight, still holding on to a belief that had long outlived its reason. I don't know if they're still alive now. No one does. But what I do know is that something about that mountain never feels empty. Even now, if you walk deep enough into the woods and the wind dies for a moment, you might catch it, the faint smell of smoke, the feeling that someone's eyes are watching from the trees. And I swear, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of footsteps fading just beyond where you can see. The seasons have a way of dulling what they can't erase. By the following spring, the search had thinned down to routine patrols and quiet visits from the families. The headlines were gone. The camera crews had stopped calling. But for those of us who'd lived with that case, it never really ended. It just settled like dust on an empty cabin floor. I still worked part-time with the park, mostly maintenance and trail history by then. Every now and then, someone new would ask about the old mystery, the 3 college hikers who never came home. Most folks spoke about it like folklore, a strange ghost story from the Shenandoah. I'd nod, maybe tell them to stick to the marked trails and leave it there. But some evenings when the light softened and the woods went quiet, I'd think about them again. About the shelter, the notebook, and the way the forest kept its secret for almost a decade. By early 2024, the official investigation was little more than a file on a shelf. The FBI kept the notebook in evidence sealed in a climate-controlled room. Their classification hadn't changed endangered adults avoiding contact. That phrase still sounded cold, like a label on something fragile. The truth was simpler. They were gone, but not lost, and no one could say which was harder to live with. Patricia stayed near the park. She bought a small cabin just off Skyline Drive, the kind with a porch that faces the valley. I visited her once that winter. The air smelled of pine smoke, and her table was covered in hiking maps folded and worn from use. She told me she hiked a few miles each weekend, leaving small care packages along the lesser-used trail's food water, a note tucked inside plastic. "If you see this, you're not alone." I asked if she really thought Tyler would find them. She smiled, that weary kind of smile that only mothers have, and said if he ever does, he'll know I never stopped waiting. Amber's sister Ashley still ran the social media page she'd started years before. It wasn't just about Amber anymore, it had become a kind of meeting place for families of the missing. She posted updates, memorial photos, sometimes short reflections about hope and forgiveness. When she talked to me on the phone, her voice carried a steadiness I hadn't heard before. "It's not about finding them anymore," she said once. "It's about keeping their names warm." I didn't understand what she meant until later. Chris's parents were quieter. They kept to themselves after that final wave of publicity. The last time I saw them was at a memorial event the park hosted in July, 10 years to the month since the kids had disappeared. The turnout surprised me. More than 100 people came. Some were hikers, some locals, some who'd only heard about it through rumor. We set up near Pass Mountain Hut, where the 3 had signed their last trail log. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just a table with photos and a small wooden plaque engraved with their names. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't talk about the investigation or the search or the years of not knowing. I just said that the forest is older than all of us, and sometimes it keeps stories we can't understand. That seemed to be enough. We all stood there for a long while listening to the wind move through the trees. Nobody rushed to leave. Not long after that, one of the younger rangers found a new fire ring near the boundary line, fresh ash, a half-burned blanket, and what looked like a jar used for collecting water. Nothing conclusive, but close enough to stir every old wound back open. The FBI sent a team out, found nothing more. Officially, it was probably a camper. Unofficially, no one wanted to say what we all thought. I went out there a week later. The air was thick with humidity, and the trail felt heavier than it used to. The fire pit was still there, rain-darkened but intact. I crouched down, sifted a little of the ash between my fingers. It was cool now, cold even. The forest hummed softly around me. Flies, cicadas, a far-off woodpecker. I remember whispering, "You can come home now," even though I knew no one was listening. Maybe I just needed to hear it out loud. By the end of that summer, life drifted back into its familiar patterns. Tourists came and went, the leaves began to change again, and a new crop of young hikers filled the trails. But for me, the park never looked quite the same. I started noticing the small details I'd missed before, the way certain hollows stayed colder than others. The faint footprints that faded before the next rain, the feeling that someone was always a few steps behind you. It wasn't fear, exactly. More like awareness, a quiet reminder that not everything out there wants to be found. I sometimes think about those first few days in 2014 when we were still hopeful. I can still see the photo of them at Pass Mountain Hut, 3 kids grinning over a camp stove full of plans, the world still wide open. I've kept a copy of that picture in my office. It sits next to a ranger badge I turned in years ago. They remind me of the same thing, that safety is never guaranteed, not even in the places we think we know best. People ask me what I think happened in the end. I don't have an answer that fits neatly into words. Maybe they're still out there living on what they can, too far gone in mind or body to come back. Maybe nature finally took them slow and quiet, the way it reclaims everything in time. Or maybe, just maybe, they found a way to let go, to step out of that endless loop of fear and shame, and simply disappear into something larger. I don't know. What I do know is that they were seen once, 3 shapes moving through the trees at dawn, a figure on a camera, a letter that vanished. That's more than most mysteries ever give. Every July now, the families gather at the plaque near Pass Mountain. They bring flowers, photos, and little things the kids loved: coffee packets, hiking socks, a sketchbook. The park allows it quiet and respectful. I go too, though I stay at the edge. It's not a vigil anymore. It's more like an understanding between the living and the lost. The mountains don't explain themselves, and neither do people. Sometimes all you can do is stand there and let both exist in the same silence. Last summer, I went alone on the anniversary early enough that the morning fog still hugged the ground. I followed the same trail until I reached the old overlook where the search teams used to rest. I could see the valley spread out below, miles of trees rolling like green waves. The world looked unchanged, but I felt every year of it. I stayed there for an hour, maybe more, before leaving a small envelope under a rock. Inside was a copy of that photo of the 3 of them, printed, new edges still crisp. On the back, I'd written just one line: "We remember you." As I hiked back down, the air grew warmer, and a red-tailed hawk circled overhead. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the pull of what-ifs. Only gratitude that the story had been told, that their names would outlast the mystery that swallowed them. Some people believe closure means finding a body or a confession or proof. I've come to think it's smaller than that. Sometimes closure is just knowing you kept looking even when you knew you wouldn't find what you wanted. That night when I got home, I sat on the porch with the lights off and listened to the cicadas hum through the dark. The sound reminded me of that first search when the forest was alive with voices calling their names. It hit me then that those echoes never really stopped. They just grew quieter, folded into the rhythm of the place. I think maybe that's how remembering works. It becomes part of the landscape until it feels natural, inevitable. If you drive through Shenandoah now, there's a small bronze marker near Big Meadows. It reads, "For the ones who walked too far to turn back." No dates, no details, just that line. Every so often, someone leaves a flower or a folded note. And on some nights when the air is still and the stars press low over the ridge, the rangers swear they see faint light flicker deep in the trees, as if a campfire burned for just a moment, then went out again. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because some disappearances never truly end. They just keep walking beside us, quiet as the wind through the pines.